Have you ever been called something so harsh, so unfair, that you still feel the weight of those words on your chest? My name is Emily Carter. I'm 37 years old, and I never imagined I'd hear the words that would hurt me most inside the church, the place where I believed I was safe. I always thought it was my refuge, my safe haven. I was the wife of a respected leader. I attended every event, helped with every ministry, sang in services, and dedicated myself body and soul. But none of that prepared me for the day my voice became a nuisance. You know that moment when you realize something is wrong and feel the need to question it? I felt it, and the moment I dared to ask, I was labeled Jezebel. Yes, that biblical figure associated with manipulation and sin. Have you ever been there? Have you ever had your integrity reduced to a cruel label just because you refuse to remain silent? What you're about to discover may surprise you, because betrayal doesn't always come from who you imagine. Often, it comes wrapped in verse, cloaked in spirituality, and spoken by people who claim to speak for God. I learned this the hard way. It wasn't just my husband's abandonment that broke me inside, but the judgment and silencing from the very community I loved. While some embraced me silently, others looked at me as if I were the very threat to the church's good testimony. And suddenly, friendships dissolved, messages stopped, invitations ceased. I became invisible, as if my pain were a scandal that needed to be hidden. Stay with me until the end, because this story isn't just about me. It's about so many Christian women who have been betrayed, abandoned, judged, and silenced, and who carry deep wounds alone, unable to understand why the faith that sustained them can also be used to crush them. But before I tell you what happened after that day they called me Jezebel, you need to understand how it all began. I was the wife of a respected leader, and that, for many, said it all. His name was mentioned with admiration in the church hallways, and by extension, I also received looks of approval. Always smiling, always ready to serve, I became the woman of faith everyone expected to see. In services, I sat beside him, and behind the scenes, I managed every detail to ensure nothing got out of hand. There was a certain pride in being seen as part of that leadership, as if my identity were intertwined with his. But behind this perfect image, there was a silent pressure to never show weakness, to never express doubts, and above all, to keep up appearances. On Sundays, I greeted dozens of people with a warm hug, and every smile I offered was almost automatic. On Wednesdays, there were endless meetings, visits, counseling sessions. It seemed like a full life, aligned with a divine purpose, but a strange feeling grew within me, as if I were living more to uphold a role than to live my own truth. The mindset that I needed to be an example in everything led me to eat my words, hide my discomfort, and ignore clear signs that something wasn't right. I believed that questioning was a form of dishonor, and this was made even more intense because in the environment we were in, everything was interpreted as a spiritual battle. Any discomfort I felt could be seen as an attack from the enemy, not a legitimate warning. The impact of this was silent, but profound. My voice grew quieter, my desires more distant, and my own sense of who I was began to fade. There were times when I'd look in the mirror and barely recognize that woman who said amen to everything. And the most painful thing was that, to outsiders, this was seen as exemplary submission, when in reality, it was forced silence. I continued participating, engaging in each project, but I felt my soul was already weary. It was as if there was a hidden truth within me, screaming to be revealed, while I struggled to appear unfazed. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because it was precisely in this contrast between the perfect image and the hidden reality that I began to notice cracks that no one else saw, cracks that sooner or later would become impossible to ignore. From the outside, our life seemed perfect. Photos on social media showed mission trips, lunches with church friends, birthday celebrations with emotional prayers. Services featured us side by side, holding hands, conveying an image of unity and purpose. I knew what people thought when they saw us. They're a blessed couple, an example to all. And perhaps for a long time, I clung to this narrative because it also gave me security. After all, who would have imagined that, behind that harmonious facade, There was an abyss opening. When the church lights went out and the doors were locked, the atmosphere changed. The man who spoke from the pulpit about love, patience, and fidelity became cold and distant. There was no physical aggression, but the calculated silence, the monosyllabic responses, and the absence of a glance said more than any words. The emotional impact of this distancing was devastating because it wasn't just a marriage growing cold, it was the deconstruction of everything I believed about partnership and faith. Conversations at home revolved around ministerial commitments, administrative issues, or veiled criticisms of my behavior. Small things I said or did became arguments to justify his dismissal. I began to question whether I was doing something wrong, whether my mindset needed to change to better adapt. I wanted to preserve that life everyone admired, but increasingly I felt like I was alone in the effort. Behind the scenes, the pressure to keep up appearances was constant. It didn't matter if I was tired or hurt. At meetings and events, my role was to smile, nod, and be the pastor's wife who inspires other women. This required immense energy, and the emotional toll would arrive in the silence of my room, where I would cry quietly so as not to be heard. This hidden truth, hidden behind a serene expression, began to erode my very identity. I still believed everything could be restored, but something inside me already understood that this perfection was fragile, built on decisions that prioritized image over relationships. And it was in this space of contradiction that the first, more serious signs began to emerge, slowly pushing me toward a reality I didn't want to face, but which was already knocking at my door. I began to notice subtle signs, almost imperceptible to outsiders, but which to me were like tiny cracks in the glass. The distance didn't appear suddenly. It crept in gradually, silently. Conversations that once flowed naturally began to be answered with short phrases, often accompanied by a gaze that no longer met my gaze. His church meetings began to stretch into the night, and when I asked why, I received vague excuses, as if my questions were an unnecessary nuisance. At first, I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was just fatigue. Maybe the pressure of ministry was getting more intense. My mindset was to always seek understanding, to put myself in his shoes, to avoid creating conflict. But the more I struggled to maintain my balance, the more I felt something slipping through the cracks. The missed calls, the cell phone that was now permanently on silent, the lack of interest in sharing details of the day, all of this created a situation that was hard to ignore. I remember nights when I'd sit on the couch waiting for the key to strike the door. The clock ticked, and the silence in the house seemed heavier. When he finally arrived, the atmosphere was cold, almost mechanical. No tight hugs, no, "I missed you." Just a hurried "good night," and the excuse that I was exhausted. It tore me apart inside because I knew it wasn't just physical fatigue. There was an emotional distance that grew with each passing day. The backstage of our relationship, once a place of connection, became a place of caution. I measured my words, calculated my questions, and avoided exposing my insecurities so as not to be accused of dramatizing. It was like living in a minefield where any misstep could lead to an even greater separation. And yet, there was a part of me that insisted on believing everything would work out, that all it took was patience and prayer. But this hope began to mix with a subtle, almost instinctive fear that the truth hidden behind so many excuses might be far more painful than I was prepared to face. It was at this point that the first revelations began to emerge, albeit fragmented, bringing with them an impact that would completely change the course of my journey. It was a Thursday night that everything changed. I was tidying the living room, putting things in order before bed, when I noticed he'd left his cell phone on the table. It wasn't usual, because he always carried it with him, as if it were an extension of his own body. The screen lit up with a notification, and my eyes caught a snippet of a message that left no room for doubt. It wasn't curiosity that made me pick up the phone. It was an almost survival instinct, that feeling that the hidden truth was finally about to be revealed. The words I read seemed to scream. They were messages charged with intimacy, with complicity, with a fondness that had long since disappeared between us. My heart raced, my breathing became heavy, and for a few seconds, I felt the ground giving way. It was as if all the pieces I'd been trying to hold together in my life had suddenly come loose. It wasn't just the discovery of a physical or emotional betrayal, it was the breaking of a pact that, for me, held sacred weight. I sat on the couch, phone still in hand, and read each exchange as if my brain needed confirmation of what my heart already knew. With each line, a part of me died a little. It wasn't just the content, but the contrast between the man everyone knew and the man revealed there, behind the scenes of secret conversations. It was proof that the endless meetings and the distancing had a reason that had nothing to do with ministerial pressure. When he arrived, I put away my phone and waited. The sound of the key in the door seemed heavier than ever. I looked at him and silently searched for answers that might not come. I decided I needed to confront him, not out of anger, but because I could no longer bear to live with that shadow growing between us. I asked him directly and saw confirmation in his eyes before the words even came out. He didn't deny it. He said he was tired, that things had changed, and that he no longer saw the point in trying. It was a brutal shock, because in that moment, I realized his decisions had already been made long before I knew the truth. I was unwittingly embarking on a journey that would test my faith, my identity, and even my emotional sanity. And that first night was just the beginning of a series of revelations I could never have imagined. I sat there, staring at him, trying to process how all of this had happened without me realizing it. It was as if I were watching my own life from the outside, watching a scene from a movie I never wanted to star in. And as he spoke, I felt a mixture of pain, disbelief, and a strange clarity. The clarity that, as much as it hurt, I needed to face every detail of this story and transform it into something that could, one day, help others feel less alone. In fact, that's why I need to ask you something right now, from the bottom of my heart. If this story has ever touched a part of you, if you've ever felt that lump in your throat listening to what I'm sharing, please like this video. It may seem like a simple gesture, but when you do this message reaches many more people who may be experiencing the same thing and need to hear that they're not alone. Every like helps keep this conversation alive and build a community where stories like mine can find echo, support, and strength. And as I talked to him that night, I realized that the answers I so desperately wanted might never come complete. His silence said so much more than any excuse. That's when I began to understand that betrayal wasn't just about the presence of another person, but about everything that had been broken within us long before that discovery. When I finally got the words out, there was no scream, no explosive anger, just a thread of pain-filled voice. I needed to hear from him, from his mouth, what was already written in my eyes. I asked directly, barely breathing between words. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to make an excuse. He didn't try to hide it. He just looked at me, expressionless, and said he was tired of me. Those 4 words echoed like a sentence. Tired of me. Not of the marriage, not of the circumstances, not of a difficult time. Of me. I felt like I'd been hit, knocking the wind out of me. It's hard to describe the impact of hearing this from someone you've dedicated years of your life to, someone with whom you've built dreams and shared the most intimate moments of your journey. Suddenly, all the moments I'd experienced with him flashed through my mind like a film, but not as sweet memories, but rather as scenes from something that, now, seemed to have been played by someone I no longer recognized. He spoke as if he had long since made his decisions, as if this conversation were merely a necessary formality to formalize something already firmly established within him. While he justified it with vague phrases about a lack of connection, a worn-out routine, and responsibilities, I sensed the hidden truth was much deeper. It was as if he had constructed a parallel world, far from me, and was now coldly inviting me to accept that I was no longer part of it. His words opened a painful space within me, but they also awakened something I hadn't expected, an almost instantaneous realization that this was a watershed moment. There was a point of no return, a moment when my mindset began to shift beyond my control. Even as I was immersed in tears, something inside me knew that this moment marked the beginning of an inevitable transformation. I didn't know how or when, but I understood that I would need to learn to navigate a territory where nothing was the same again. As he sat, avoiding my gaze, I absorbed every gesture, every pause, trying to find some trace of the man I once knew. I didn't. And it was in this emptiness that I realized the most difficult revelations were yet to come, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves and force me to face what I feared most. That night, after the confrontation, I didn't sleep. I lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how my life had changed so much in such a short time. When morning came, the first decision I made was to seek help. I believed the church council, made up of people who had lived with us for years, would be a safe place. They were men and women who knew our story, who had followed our faith journey, who had seen us serve side by side. I expected acceptance, guidance, perhaps even some mediation. I entered the meeting room with my heart racing, carrying with me not only the pain of betrayal, but also the hope of finding support there. With a trembling voice, I shared what I had discovered. I didn't omit details, but I also didn't seek to expose anyone beyond what was necessary. I needed them to understand the gravity of the situation, because for me, this wasn't just a marital problem, but a breach of the principles we had always preached together. But as I spoke, I noticed something strange. The looks weren't of compassion, they were of assessment. There were awkward silences, quick glances exchanged between them, as if something was being decided there that wasn't being said aloud. And then, one of the most influential people in the leadership, someone I deeply respected, took a deep breath and said that perhaps I was overreacting, that my role now should be to restore and keep the testimony. It was as if my pain had to be hidden to preserve a public image. I felt the ground disappear again. There were no words of encouragement, not even a sincere prayer in that moment. Only cold advice about avoiding comments, not sharing my story with anyone, and trusting that God was in control. It was a clear attempt to silence me. I, who had arrived seeking support, left carrying an even greater weight, the weight of knowing that for them, my suffering was a risk to the institution's reputation. At that moment, I understood that the leadership I so admired also had its own behind-the-scenes agenda, and that these behind-the-scenes agendas weren't always consistent with what was preached from the pulpit. This revelation profoundly changed my mindset because it showed me that sometimes the greatest battle isn't against what's happening at home, but against the walls that should protect us, but instead become walls of judgment. And it was this realization that paved the way for an even more painful, yet also decisive experience in how I would view faith from then on. I was still trying to digest the cold words I'd heard when, amidst that silent, tense meeting, one of the most influential women in the leadership leaned forward slightly, looked me in the eye, and said in a firm, almost solemn voice, "You have the spirit of Jezebel." For a moment, I thought I'd misunderstood. It sounded so absurd, so out of context that my mind took a while to process it. But no, she'd repeated it, as if she were warning me of danger, when in fact, she was sentencing me. At that moment, it wasn't just the label that hurt me, but the spiritual weight it carried. Within the universe we lived in, being called a Jezebel was more than an insult. It was being associated with rebellion, manipulation, and destruction. It was essentially casting me as the biblical villain everyone feared. I felt as if I'd been ripped from my place as a betrayed wife and placed on the stand, all without anyone questioning the gravity of what was being said. The room grew even heavier. Some looked away, others simply crossed their arms, as if this were the logical conclusion of everything I had explained. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that my questioning stemmed from pain, not rebellion. But I realized that for them, I was already marked. It was more convenient to believe that my attitude had evil roots than to face the flaws of someone who, until then, had been seen as an exemplary leader. The psychological impact was immediate. I left carrying a stigma, and that label began to echo in my mind, as if somehow I needed to prove at every step that I wasn't that. My faith journey, which had always been built on surrender and trust, was now under constant scrutiny. It was like living under an inverted spotlight, shining not to highlight virtues, but to magnify any shadows. That night, alone at home, I reflected on how many decisions and perceptions can be shaped by words uttered in the heat of the moment. This was one of the greatest revelations of this phase, that a single judgment, coming from someone in a position of authority, has the power to shape not only the narrative, but also the way a person begins to see themselves. And so it was that the label became a wound I would need to learn to heal, even as new pains and discoveries were still on the way. I left that room, feeling as if I were carrying an invisible weight on my shoulders. The words echoed in my mind, repeating themselves like an unwanted refrain. You have the spirit of Jezebel. I walked through the parking lot trying to maintain my composure, but inside, everything was crumbling. With each step, the question lingered. Is questioning a sin? It was a genuine doubt, born not of rebellion, but of the profound confusion into which I had been cast. I had always believed that faith should be a safe space for sincere questions, for dialogues that lead to truth. But there, in that context, it seemed that any attempt to understand was already seen as an affront. This feeling began to corrode something inside me. I spent days replaying every conversation, every gesture, trying to pinpoint the moment I had crossed an invisible line. The cruelest part was that when I sought answers, I was met with a deafening silence. No one directly told me I was wrong, but neither did anyone offer me the comfort I so desperately needed. It was as if my pain had become a forbidden topic, something that needed to be kept behind the scenes so as not to affect the harmony of the community. I began to doubt myself. I wondered if somehow my reaction had been exaggerated, if I should have endured it in silence to avoid the scandal. This identity crisis shook my mindset in ways I never imagined. I, who had always been firm in my convictions, now found myself lost in an emotional labyrinth where every decision seemed fraught with unpredictable consequences. The hidden truth is that, more than the betrayal itself, what destroyed me was the way I was being treated by those who claimed to love me as spiritual family. There were nights when I cried myself to sleep, and others when sleep simply wouldn't come. The impact of this kind of rejection is profound, because it affects not only your self-esteem, but also your relationship with God. I prayed, but my words felt stuck in my throat, and yet, amidst all this confusion, something inside me whispered that I wasn't wrong for seeking the truth. It was a thread of hope I refused to let go of, even when everything around me tried to convince me otherwise. This small flame would be what guided me in the days to come, when the pressure to keep quiet would become even more intense. The pressure to keep quiet began subtly, almost as advice for my own good. The first conversations were filled with phrases like, "It's not worth exposing," "Think about your image," or "Remember that God is the one who justifies." But soon, this subtlety gave way to direct and categorical instructions. I shouldn't talk about what happened, and this wasn't a suggestion, it was a veiled order. They justified it by saying it was to protect the ministry, preserve the testimony, and prevent those weaker in faith from being scandalized. Behind seemingly pious words, there was a clear attempt to isolate me within a suffocating silence. This imposition had an immense psychological weight. It was as if, suddenly, my story had ceased to belong to me. I couldn't narrate, explain, or even vent without risking being seen as a threat. And, to make matters worse, the distorted logic repeated itself. If I remained silent, it would be a sign of spiritual maturity. If I spoke, I would be proving them right to label me as someone with bad intentions. This dynamic is cruel because it undermines self-confidence and distorts the sense of justice. Behind the scenes, I overheard conversations that were never directly directed at me, but which carried implicit messages. Insinuations that hurt people always try to take others down with them. Comments about how the enemy uses resentment to destroy God's work. These phrases were like arrows, launched from afar, but always finding their target. I knew that with each passing day, my version of events became less relevant than the narrative they were constructing about me. This experience forced me to rethink many of my life's decisions. I realized that for too long I had confused submission with self-denial. The mindset that had kept me trapped in the idea that questioning was wrong was beginning to crumble. But even so, breaking that pattern meant facing not only the pain of betrayal, but also the rejection of a community I loved. The hidden truth, which few admit, is that protecting the ministry often means protecting only the reputation of a few, not the well-being of all. This revelation was painful, but it would be fundamental for the next steps of my journey, when loneliness would cease to be merely emotional and become social as well. Isolation came like a silent tide, without warning, but with enough force to rip me from whatever foothold I had. At first, there were just a few silences in conversations, delayed responses on the phone, invitations that stopped coming. Then came total absence, messages that were never answered, averted glances in church hallways, social gatherings where I was no longer remembered. It was as if suddenly I had ceased to exist. The friends with whom I once shared confidences, who laughed with me backstage at events and accompanied me on ministry tasks, now maintained a calculated distance. I sensed their effort to avoid closeness, as if my presence posed a risk to them. And perhaps, in some way, it did. Not because I posed a threat, but because getting close to me meant getting involved in a story everyone was trying to bury. The exclusion wasn't explicit. There were no direct confrontations, but the emptiness around me spoke volumes. Loneliness took over my daily routine in a way I'd never experienced before. Even places that once were refuge became hostile territory. The church pew where I used to sit felt cold. The coffee after the service no longer held smiles or light conversations. I was physically present, but invisible to passers-by. This profoundly affected my mentality, because I realized that the sense of belonging can be taken away from us without anyone having to say a word. I began to question not only what had happened, but also the relationships I'd considered solid. I realized how, in many cases, the bond was sustained more by the shared environment than by a true connection. And when that environment stopped accepting me, many of those bonds broke. It was a harsh but also enlightening revelation. My journey from then on would need to be built on much more authentic foundations, even if that meant going it alone for a while. This forced separation created space for a different kind of silence, not the kind imposed by leadership, but the kind that comes from being left out. And it was in this void that I began to realize the true extent of the emotional toll I was experiencing, while other layers of pain and discovery were yet to be revealed. Over time, I realized that isolation wasn't just a physical absence from others, but also an attempt to silence my voice. And that's precisely why I believe that when we speak, something changes. So if listening to my story reminds you of something you've experienced, or if any part of what I've said so far has awakened a feeling or thought in you, share it in the comments. Your words aren't just an answer to me. They could be the relief another woman needs to read to feel less alone. It's incredible how, when someone opens up, they create a safe space for other stories to find a place. And it was like this, understanding the value of each voice, that I began to notice that even in the most painful silence, there are seeds of transformation, ready to blossom when someone decides to break the mold and speak the truth. Gradually, the isolation began to give way to an even heavier feeling, guilt. It was as if every silence I faced, every sudden separation, confirmed the narrative that I had somehow provoked it all. I began to mentally revisit every conversation, every gesture, every decision I had made in recent years. I wondered if I should have been more patient, more tolerant, less insistent in seeking answers. This spiral of questioning became suffocating, because the more I tried to find a specific point where I had gone wrong, the more I realized there was no single clear moment, just a succession of situations that, little by little, distorted my perception of myself. Behind the scenes of my mind, a silent battle raged every day. On the one hand, I knew that no one deserves to be betrayed or silenced, regardless of the mistakes they may have made. On the other, the way everything was being handled around me pushed me to believe that my stance, my questions, and even my pain were a bigger problem than the betrayal itself. It was as if my existence, in that context, had become inconvenient. This feeling had a profound impact on my mindset. I, who had always seen myself as strong and resilient, began to see myself as fragile, overly sensitive, and inadequate to handle pressure. And this kind of belief infiltrates every aspect of life, in prayers, in casual conversations, in the way you present yourself to others. The hidden truth is that when guilt is planted consistently, it takes deep root and suffocates even the firmest convictions. I remember nights when I tried to pray and found myself asking for forgiveness for things that, rationally, I knew weren't my responsibility. It was as if I were trying to make up for something invisible, a mistake that was never clearly pointed out, but that everyone seemed to believe existed. And as this guilt deepened, I realized that it stemmed not only from betrayal or abandonment, but primarily from how the people around me chose to handle it. It was at this point that I understood that the weight I carried wasn't just emotional, but also spiritual and social, a collectively constructed burden placed upon me, as if it were my duty to bear it in silence. And it was thus, carrying this weight, that I took the next steps on a journey that would yet bring revelations capable of changing everything. There came a time when the feeling of being on the brink of collapse stopped being just emotional and became physical. I would wake up and not know exactly where to turn, because the places that once welcomed me now felt hostile. The church, which for years had been my second home, had become a place filled with painful memories and eyes that avoided mine. My marriage no longer existed, at least not in a real sense, and the idea of family I'd carried with me slipped away, like sand slipping through my fingers. Loneliness wasn't just being alone at home, but feeling like there was no single place where I could truly rest and be myself. This lack of ground made me realize how everything I had built was, in some way, anchored in bonds that couldn't stand the test. The mindset I had before, that stability came from keeping everything in order and avoiding questioning, now seemed like a cruel illusion. Behind the scenes of my life, there was a void that grew wider with each passing day, and this void drained my energy, my hope, and even my faith. It was strange to think that, even though I knew the Bible intimately, even though I had counseled so many people not to give up, I now found myself in the exact place I had so often tried to help others out of. The hidden truth is that nothing prepares us for when we are the ones who fall into the abyss. I could no longer find meaning in the prayers that once comforted me. The praises that once brought me to tears of emotion now only reminded me of everything I had lost. It was as if my story had been cut short, and I didn't know if I would have the strength to write the rest. My routine, once full of commitments, was reduced to long, silent, and colorless days. The simplest decisions felt like mountains, and even getting out of bed felt like a victory. There were moments when I wondered if I would ever feel true joy again, or if I was destined to live merely surviving. And it was at this point, at the lowest point of my journey, that I realized that, although all seemed lost, there was something about to move, something that didn't originate from outside, but that was beginning to blossom within me, even if I couldn't yet see it clearly. It was on a silent dawn, one of those nights when sleep simply won't come, that I picked up the Bible more out of habit than faith. The cover was worn, the pages smelled of memory, and yet I felt strange holding it, as if the book that had always been my guide had become a distant territory. I leafed through it aimlessly until my eyes landed on the story of Esther. I already knew every detail: the young Jewish woman who became queen, the strategic silence she maintained about her origins, the crucial moment when she decided to risk everything to save her people. But that night, something felt different. I didn't read it simply as a historical account or a lesson in courage. I read it as someone who understood for the first time the weight of remaining silent in the face of a truth that needs to be spoken. The words seemed to penetrate the barrier of my apathy. When Esther heard from Mordecai that she had arrived in the kingdom for such a time as this, I felt that phrase reach my heart through centuries. It was as if God was reminding me that even in chaos, there is a purpose, and more than that He never silences the truth. It wasn't about acting impulsively or turning my pain into a banner, but about recognizing that the truth, however uncomfortable, cannot be buried forever without consequences. At that moment, I realized my journey didn't have to end at rock bottom. I could choose to view the situation not just as a victim of injustice, but as someone with a story with the power to create transformation. This shift in mindset didn't happen magically or instantly, but there, alone with that text, I felt a seed being planted. A decision was beginning to form, still timid, but real. I would not be silenced by the narrative they tried to impose on me. I closed the Bible carefully, as if to preserve that moment intact. I didn't know exactly what the next step would be, but I was clear that I couldn't continue living as before. Esther's story reminded me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. And it was with this still small flame that I began to glimpse a path out of the darkness I found myself in. A path that would require more revelations, more confrontations, and, inevitably, decisions that would change the course of my life. That reading left me restless for days. It was as if every word of Esther's story kept echoing within me, slowly reshaping the way I saw everything that was happening. Until then, I had been trained to believe that remaining silent in the face of wrongdoing was synonymous with spiritual maturity, that avoiding conflict was proof of submission, and that questioning unjust decisions was somehow rebellious. But now, a new thought began to take hold. What if, in fact, questioning were an act of integrity? What if, in this context, remaining silent meant condoning what had hurt me and so many others? This shift in mindset didn't happen dramatically, like in a movie where the character suddenly wakes up and changes the course of her life. It was more like a slow sunrise, gradually illuminating every dark corner. I began to realize that courage didn't have to be loud. It could manifest itself in the simple act of telling the truth, even if my voice trembled. I understood that integrity isn't just about keeping promises, but about not compromising what is essential to my conscience and my faith. As I thought about it, I realized that much of what kept me trapped in fear was worry about the impact of my words. I feared losing even more: friendships, respect, any vestige of belonging I had left. But as I reflected, I realized I had already lost almost everything, and yet I was still standing. The real loss would be giving up who I was to maintain a facade that had already shattered. It was as if, at that moment, a key had turned inside me. It didn't mean I would go out and expose everything thoughtlessly, but rather that I would no longer allow myself to be blamed for simply seeking justice. A new strength was emerging, and with it, the clarity that my journey wouldn't be about proving something to others, but about living in accordance with my beliefs. This revelation began to prepare me for the decisions I knew were coming, choices that would require not only fortitude, but also discernment to face the upcoming battles. It was as if, after years of living in a ruined world, I had finally decided to pick up the bricks and begin rebuilding. There was no rush, nor the anxiety of someone trying to prove to the world that they'd quickly rebuilt. It was a silent, almost intimate process in which each step held profound meaning. Therapy helped me examine wounds I'd learned to ignore, but which continued to bleed inside. I discovered that much of my pain stemmed not only from what had happened, but from how I'd learned to keep quiet, to hide, to believe that feeling was a sign of weakness. Going back to school was another decision that gave me a boost, not just to fill my time, but to reopen doors within myself that had been locked. Books, notes, and discussions began to rekindle something I thought I'd lost: the ability to dream. I remembered who I was before being shaped by fear, someone curious, passionate about learning, who wasn't shy about asking uncomfortable questions if it led her to the truth. In this process, rediscovering who I was in Christ was like finding a clean mirror after years of looking at distorted reflections. I realized that my identity wasn't tied to positions, titles, or the approval of leaders, but to the simple and profound fact of being loved and known by Him. This changed everything. It didn't mean the scars would disappear, but that they would no longer be the center of my story. There were days when I felt fragile, almost back to the point of giving up, but it was precisely in those moments that I understood the importance of having deep roots. With each therapy session, each page studied, each sincere prayer, it was as if a solid foundation was being built beneath my feet, and, even without realizing it, I was gathering the tools I would need to face the challenges that would inevitably arise along the way. It was during this period of rebuilding, when I was still treading carefully on ground that had previously crumbled, that something unexpected began to happen. New people began to cross my path, and these weren't random encounters. They were connections that seemed carefully prepared, as if each one had been placed there for a specific purpose. God, in His silent and precise way of working, surrounded me with women with different stories, but with one thing in common. They knew how to listen without rushing, without masks, without the need to offer ready-made answers. At first, I confess, it felt strange. After so long getting used to measuring every word, to maintaining the acceptable version of my story, being in front of someone who didn't want to shape or fix what I said, but simply welcome it, was almost uncomfortable. But little by little, the discomfort turned into relief. In each conversation, I felt as if I was returning to myself parts that had been ripped away amidst the chaos. These new friendships brought something I didn't know I needed: the freedom to exist without having to justify every step. There were no disapproving looks disguised as spiritual concern, no heavy silences that carried more judgment than comfort. Instead, there were laughter shared over long coffees, prayers offered without a script, tears that didn't need to be hidden. It was like taking a deep breath after years of holding it. I also learned from them that we don't need to have a perfect trajectory to be instruments of healing in each other's lives. Some had their own scars exposed, others carried unresolved pain, but they all had something in common: a genuine willingness to walk together, without rushing and without comparisons. It wasn't a club of the wounded, but a community of real people who understand that life with God isn't a flawless showcase, but rather a journey full of ups and downs, where each step is more important than the appearance of stability. The presence of these women helped me break the mindset I'd absorbed for years, the one that said being vulnerable was dangerous, that opening my heart was a sign of weakness. Instead, I began to realize that vulnerability, when shared with the right people, is actually a bridge that connects pain to healing, questions to answers, and, often, answers to new questions. And there were also the small revelations in the details: an encouraging message on a difficult day, an unexpected invitation to a simple meeting, a hug that seemed to straighten every misaligned piece of my heart. Seemingly small things, but they carried a profound impact. This showed me that transformation often comes not in the form of grand events, but in everyday gestures that, together, create lasting change. Over time, I realized that these friendships were not only a gift from God during my healing process, but also a reminder that He never leaves anyone completely alone, even when every circumstance tries to convince me otherwise. They were there to help me see that there was still a long way to go, and that, while part of that path was mine alone, other parts would be walked side by side with people willing to hold my hand when the terrain became uncertain. And it was on this shared journey, surrounded by stories, prayers, and heartfelt confessions, that a new kind of courage began to emerge. Not a loud, impulsive kind, but a quiet strength that prepared me to take the next step without fear of losing who I was in the process. A strength that grew in the certainty that, even when faced with new challenges, I would no longer face everything alone. And it was on this journey, surrounded by new friendships and experiences that breathed truth, that my view of faith began to change profoundly. Previously, I saw it as a set of fixed structures, a mold that needed to be followed precisely, with no room for deviation or questioning. But after everything I've experienced, I've realized that true faith isn't fragile enough to crumble in the face of difficult questions. On the contrary, it's precisely when we're confronted with life's hidden truths that it reveals its true strength. I learned, perhaps the most painful way, that the church is made up of people, and people make mistakes. Some make mistakes out of ignorance, others out of fear, and some out of attachment to power or their own image. At first, this revolted me because I had confused the institution with God Himself. When human failings became evident, it was as if everything had collapsed together. But gradually, I realized that God remains God, regardless of the cracks in the walls built by men. This realization freed me from an invisible prison. I no longer needed to rely on the behavior or approval of others to measure my closeness to Him. I understood that my journey didn't need to be validated by a system to be legitimate. It was a silent but profound transformation. I stopped seeking only the place where I fit in and began to build within myself a solid space where my faith could breathe, grow, and above all, remain alive, even when everything around me seemed unstable. This new mindset also gave me clarity to see how traditions and expectations created over time can often stifle the essence of what Christ truly taught. I began to value a personal relationship with God more than any semblance of religiosity. I understood that He is not limited to a building, or a Sunday event, but reveals himself in our daily lives, in our silent decisions, in the impact we leave on people's lives, and even in the behind-the-scenes moments of our own story. Those moments no one sees, but which shape who we truly are. It was through this process that my sensitivity to what truly comes from him increased. I began to differentiate what is genuine from what is merely ritual, what is true love from what is disguised control. This doesn't mean I've lost respect or despised the faith community, but that I now know how to filter what is human from what is divine, without confusing the two. This distinction has protected me from turning away from God when I've been disappointed by people, and at the same time, it has allowed me to have more compassion for those who still live, trapped in patterns I myself once followed without question. And this change didn't happen overnight. It was the result of honest conversations, moments of silence, and many encounters with myself and God, where I had to admit that I didn't have all the answers, and that was okay. Interestingly, I realized that faith, as it matures, doesn't eliminate questions, but embraces them, because it's in the space between doubt and hope that trust becomes more real. Looking back today makes me realize how much my journey was shaped by both failures and victories, and it's this mix of fragility and strength that makes me want to keep going, even when I can't see the whole path ahead. Because I understood that faith isn't about having a perfect map, but about keeping walking even when all you have is God's voice telling you to take one more step. And it was precisely in this next step that something unexpected began to happen. Something that was not in my control, but that would change, once again, the direction of this journey. For me, forgiveness wasn't an instantaneous act, the kind we decide on in a moment, and then, presto, the wound heals. It was a slow, almost artisanal process, as if I were peeling away layer by layer a wound that, for a long time, I'd preferred to hide. I didn't want to live chained to hatred, because I realized it's a silent poison. It corrodes from within, steals peace, and distorts the way we see the world and ourselves. But at the same time, forgiveness didn't mean erasing memory or romanticizing what happened. It didn't come to justify injustices, but to free me from the weight that was no longer mine to carry. It was along this path that I understood something that changed my mindset. Forgiveness isn't handing over a blank check for history to repeat itself. It's establishing clear boundaries, erecting invisible fences that protect the heart without hardening it. Because true forgiveness doesn't ask you to remain silent to maintain peace. It empowers you to speak the truth without losing yourself in resentment. And it was precisely then that I found myself faced with a revelation that seemed obvious, but which, in practice, is profoundly transformative. You can free someone from the weight of your hurt and at the same time decide that you no longer want to put yourself in the same place of vulnerability. I had already experienced the devastating impact of having my voice stifled, of having my decisions questioned by those who used authority to maintain control. So, when forgiveness arrived, it was accompanied by a firm conviction. I would never again allow myself to be silenced. This choice was born not from a place of rebellion, but from integrity. It was as if an inner door had opened to a space where I could be whole, without needing to apologize for existing or for thinking differently. The curious thing is that when I position myself this way, some people distance themselves, and in that moment, I understood that it wasn't a loss, it was a filtering. Those who would truly walk with me in this new phase needed to understand that my journey was no longer driven by the need to please or keep up appearances, but by the search for truth, however uncomfortable it might be. And this clarity brought a strange, almost paradoxical peace, because it came along with the certainty that the road ahead would still bring confrontations and difficult decisions. Behind the scenes of this transformation, I realized that forgiveness is also a kind of silent revolution. It disarms without you having to fight with the same weapons that hurt you. It exposes the hidden truth that freedom doesn't depend on how others treat you, but on how you choose to respond. And for me, this was a turning point that gave me back not only my voice, but also the confidence that I could live without conforming to the expectations of a system or specific people. This new way of walking didn't make me immune to pain, but it gave me a different perspective on it. Today, I understand that some wounds remain as scars, not to remind me of what I lost, but to confirm how much I've grown. And it was precisely at this point, when it seemed life had already shown me everything about loss and new beginnings, that something unexpected began to appear on the horizon, demanding from me a courage I didn't yet know I possessed. When I finally took the step to connect with a new community, I realized it wasn't just about having a group again, but about rebuilding trust in collective spaces. I carried, like a shadow, the fear of being silenced again or seen as a problem to be fixed. But, to my surprise, I was welcomed without labels, without invasive questions, and without that veiled pressure to fit into pre-packaged molds. It was a place where stories, even the most painful ones, weren't used as ammunition against us, but as bridges to connection. Being among women who carried wounds similar to mine was like entering sacred territory, where vulnerability was not exploited, but honored. Each encounter carried the weight of a silent revelation, realizing that I was no exception, that the injustices I experienced were not the result of my weakness, but of systems that often hide behind spiritual discourses to maintain control. This profoundly affected my mindset, because it made me understand that when truth is shared in a safe environment, it ceases to be just memory and becomes a tool for transformation. The behind-the-scenes nature of this group was touchingly simple: meetings held in someone's living room, tea served in different mugs, laughter that broke the weight of confessions. But, at the same time, there was a real impact happening there. It was a space where one person's tears became everyone's responsibility, where there was no rush to heal or ready-made formulas for starting over. I learned that caring for someone isn't about offering answers, but about presence. And curiously, it was in this discreet welcome that I found answers to questions I didn't even know I still carried. Over time, I began to realize something even more profound. I wasn't there just to receive, but also to give. The experiences I'd previously seen as scars now became living testimonies, capable of paving the way for other women to see they weren't alone. And in this exchange, I understood that the healing journey is never a solitary one. It multiplies in the lives of those we touch, even if they don't realize it. There were, of course, days when the memories weighed heavily, when I had to fight the old tendency to keep quiet to avoid conflict. But each time I chose to speak, even with a trembling voice, I felt I was reaffirming a commitment to myself, to never allow the truth to be stifled again. And the most impressive thing is that this stance began to inspire others. I saw in their eyes the same sparkle I once felt when someone had the courage to say what no one else would. It was as if, together, we were rewriting narratives, breaking old patterns, and making room for a new mindset. This return to community didn't mean recovering what was lost in the past, but creating something new, more authentic and resilient. A space where we don't have to pretend to be strong all the time, but where we learn that strength often lies precisely in admitting when we need support. And it was in this movement of mutual surrender that I began to realize that my story was still under construction, and that God, silently and strategically, was leading me toward a purpose that went far beyond myself, planting seeds that, sooner or later, would blossom in ways I hadn't even imagined. If I could sit before someone who today carries the burden of having been unfairly labeled, judged, or diminished simply for taking a stand, I would say, looking them in the eye, "You are not wrong for demanding respect. There is nothing sinful in defending your dignity, nor in raising your voice when the truth is stifled. You are not a rebel for questioning. You are not ungrateful for exposing injustice. And you are definitely not a Jezebel for refusing to be silenced. You are, and always will be, a beloved daughter of a God who does not fear questions, who is not offended by the sincere search for answers, and who does not turn away when your heart cries out for justice." What we're often not told is that genuine faith isn't fueled by blind obedience, but by built trust. And trust needs space to be real, space to acknowledge wounds, to admit doubts, and to rebuild slowly. When someone tries to place a burden on you that God never placed, it says more about that person's insecurities than about your worth. The hidden truth behind many religious discourses is that in some cases, The fear of losing control speaks louder than genuine love, and that's precisely why so many stories of transformation are born from the courage to break with distorted narratives. The journey may be lonely at first, but remember, the solitude of integrity is infinitely lighter than the companionship of forced submission. There is a strength that emerges when we decide we will no longer mold ourselves to fit into spaces that diminish who we are. This decision shifts our mindset, redefines priorities, and opens doors that once seemed locked. And even though the pain is real, it is never useless. Each scar can become a map for others to find their way back to themselves. The impact of adopting this stance goes far beyond you. It resonates in the lives of those who observe, of those who hear your story and realize they too can choose freedom. And perhaps it's at this point, when you understand that your voice isn't yours alone, that you begin to see the true scope of your journey, a scope that often only reveals itself when we least expect it, but which is already in motion, silently transforming stories all around. I tell all this because I know how much silence can be a prison. Many women carry within them stifled stories, voices that could never be heard, feelings that accumulate like stones in their chests. The weight of silence doesn't disappear with time, it transforms into something more corrosive, and that's exactly why I decided to speak out. Not because it's comfortable, but because I've discovered that vulnerability, when exposed in the right light, doesn't weaken us, it liberates us. The truth is that each honest account opens an invisible space for others to find courage. It's like lighting a small flame in a dark hallway, and suddenly realizing there are other hands reaching out with candles to light it too. There's immense power in breaking the cycle of fear, and it begins with the decision to not let pain be the last word. Sharing what I've experienced doesn't erase the past, but it gives it new meaning. I transform memories that once imprisoned me into bridges that others can cross. This is the revelation few share. Our testimony isn't just about us, it's about those who are still trying to find a way out. And when we realize that the impact of speaking out goes beyond our own journey, something shifts within us. It stops being about proving a point or responding to those who hurt us, and becomes about paving the way for those still trying to get back on their feet. The behind the scenes of my story isn't pretty, but it's real. And real is what connects. Real is what cuts through the noise and reaches the hearts of those who listen. If there's a purpose in everything I've lived, it's in not wasting this experience, in making it an instrument of transformation. I know that, for some, the words they hear can be the first crack in the wall that keeps them trapped. And if my voice can create that crack, then everything else was worth it. Because in the end, it's not just about telling, but about allowing each person to discover that they too can write a new chapter.